In 1943, two men from Pittsburgh both had $10,000 saved. Same city, same war, same government rationing bread, butter, and gasoline. One of them was a steelworker named Harold. He kept his money exactly where his bank manager told him to keep it, a savings account at First National. Safe, patriotic, sensible. He was doing what everyone told him to do. Keep it safe, do not speculate, wait for the war to end. By 1946, his $10,000 had the purchasing power of about $8,400. 3 years of war had quietly stolen 16% of everything he had saved, and he never saw a cent leave his account. The other man was a machinist named Chester. He had done something different. Not reckless, not lucky. He followed a framework his father-in-law built during the Great Depression and applied it to the world he was actually living in. By the end of the war, Chester's $10,000 had grown to just over $31,000. Same city, same war, same starting point. Harold lost 16% in real terms. Chester gained over 200%. I spent weeks going through wartime economic records, Federal Reserve archives, and declassified Treasury documents, trying to understand exactly what Chester understood that Harold did not. What I found was not complicated, it was not secret, but it went completely against what the government was telling average Americans to do with their money. 4 things, 4 specific categories, and once you understand the mechanism behind each one, you will start seeing the same patterns show up again and again, not just in the 1940s, but in every major economic disruption since. My name is Sam. On this channel, we usually talk about personal finance, investing, saving, and the psychology of money. But sometimes the best financial lessons come from history. If you are worried about inflation, geopolitical instability, or what happens to your savings when the world becomes unstable, this is exactly what you need to understand. Hit subscribe. I break down these kinds of patterns every week, and hit the like button while you're at it. It tells the algorithm this is worth showing to more people. Let us get into it. Why wars make some people rich. The thing most people don't realize about wartime economies is this. They assume war destroys wealth. They think the suffering is spread evenly, that when things get bad, everyone gets poor together. The historical data shows something very different. War doesn't destroy wealth, it transfers it. It moves at extraordinary speed from people holding the wrong assets into the hands of people holding the right ones. And the pattern of who wins and who loses isn't random. It follows a specific logic that repeats every single time. I call it the wartime scarcity premium, and here's how it worked. Before December 7th, 1941, the United States federal government spent about $9 billion a year. That sounds like a lot until you consider that by 1945, it was spending $93 billion. That's not a typo. 10 times in 5 years. That money didn't just evaporate into the war, it moved. It flowed through the economy into specific industries, specific companies, specific asset classes at a pace and scale that had never existed before and hasn't since. At the same time, 4 things happened simultaneously that changed the rules of wealth entirely. First, normal supply chains collapsed overnight. Things that had been freely available suddenly became scarce. Scarcity creates pricing power for whoever still has supply. Second, government spending guaranteed revenue for specific industries at levels that made normal market competition irrelevant. The customer had unlimited credit and didn't care about price. Third, inflation started running quietly but relentlessly. Cash didn't sit still. It shrank every month, every year. Fourth, most people had no framework for understanding any of this. They were doing what they'd been told, saving in cash, buying war bonds, being prudent, while the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. Chester understood those 4 dynamics. Harold did not. Here are the 4 specific things that made people like Chester rich, while everyone else was just trying to get through. Asset number 1. Defense and industrial contractors. When the United States mobilized for World War II, one of the most immediate economic effects was the rapid expansion of industrial production. Companies capable of building aircraft, ships, engines, communication systems, and heavy machinery suddenly found themselves operating at a scale that had never existed before. Before the war, firms like Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas Aircraft, and General Electric were already established manufacturers, but their production capacity was relatively modest compared to what came next. The real shift came through government spending. In 1940, total federal spending in the United States was about $9.5 billion. By the peak of wartime mobilization, annual federal spending had risen to more than $90 billion. A large share of that spending flowed directly into industrial production. Aircraft manufacturing alone expanded dramatically. Douglas Aircraft, for example, produced nearly 30,000 aircraft during the war and ranked fifth among all U.S. corporations in the total value of wartime production contracts. From an investor's perspective, the key takeaway wasn't simply that war increases demand for weapons. It was that large segments of the industrial economy suddenly became essential components of national infrastructure. At the same time, wartime contracting wasn't a guaranteed windfall for every company involved. Many contracts operated under cost-plus arrangements, where firms were reimbursed for expenses plus a regulated profit margin. This limited extreme profits in some cases and created its own inefficiencies. And when the war ended in 1945, the environment changed quickly. Military contracts declined sharply, and some defense-oriented companies faced sudden drops in demand as production shifted back towards civilian markets. The investors who benefited most from this period were typically those who recognized the scale of industrial mobilization early, before wartime production became the dominant economic story. Asset number 2, industrial commodities and raw materials. If defense contractors were building the machines of war, someone still had to supply the materials those machines required. Modern industrial warfare consumes enormous quantities of physical resources: steel for ships and armored vehicles, aluminum for aircraft, copper for electrical systems and communications equipment, oil for transportation, fuel, and aviation. As the war expanded, demand for these materials increased dramatically. However, commodity markets during World War II did not function as normal free markets. The U.S. government imposed extensive economic controls to stabilize prices and direct resources toward the war effort. Prices for many industrial materials were regulated, and production priorities were centrally managed to ensure that critical industries received the supplies they needed. But even within that controlled system, producers of key materials often operated at extremely high capacity. Mining companies, refineries, and metal processors ran continuously to meet wartime production needs. Major firms such as Kennecott Copper, Anaconda Copper, and Alcoa, the dominant aluminum producer in the United States at the time, became essential suppliers to the industrial supply chains supporting the war effort. Energy producers played a similarly critical role. Mechanized warfare required enormous quantities of fuel, and oil companies supplying refined petroleum products became strategically important to both military operations and industrial logistics. For investors examining this period, the key takeaway is that wartime demand often places enormous pressure on the upstream layers of the economy, the companies responsible for extracting and processing the physical inputs that industrial production depends on. Asset number 3. Real estate in strategic production centers. Real estate is not usually the first asset people associate with wartime economic expansion. Periods of geopolitical uncertainty often create the impression that property markets will weaken as risk increases. But the historical data from World War II shows that location mattered enormously. Cities that became major centers of defense production experienced rapid population growth as workers moved to fill newly created industrial jobs. Detroit became one of the central manufacturing hubs of the wartime economy, producing tanks, vehicles, and aircraft engines. Shipbuilding and naval operations drove major expansions in cities such as San Diego and several Pacific Coast ports. Aircraft manufacturing and other defense industries also expanded rapidly across parts of California, Washington, and the Northeast. These developments created large inflows of workers into specific regions. As labor moved toward the industries driving wartime production, demand for housing increased in those areas. Rental markets in several defense manufacturing cities became significantly tighter as a result. At the same time, property markets in areas without major industrial expansion often saw far less growth. From an investment perspective, the pattern was fairly consistent. Real estate performance during the war was closely tied to where government spending and industrial expansion were concentrated. The catalyst was not the war itself. It was the geographic movement of labor and capital toward the industries that wartime production depended on. Asset number 4. Government bonds and financial stability. One of the most visible financial instruments associated with World War II was the war bond. The U.S. government actively encouraged civilians to purchase savings bonds to help finance the war effort. More than 84 million Americans eventually bought Series E war bonds during the conflict. These bonds were marketed primarily as a safe and patriotic savings vehicle for households, but the broader government bond market played a more complex role in the wartime financial system. Beginning in 1942, the Federal Reserve worked with the Treasury to stabilize government borrowing costs by effectively capping long-term Treasury yields at around 2.5%. To maintain that rate, the Federal Reserve stood ready to purchase government bonds if necessary. This policy created a stable market for Treasury securities during a period of extraordinary government borrowing. However, inflation gradually accelerated as wartime spending expanded. Consumer prices rose roughly 30% between 1941 and the end of the war, and that 30% is what the government's own index showed, with price controls masking the true inflation underneath. For investors holding long-term bonds with fixed yields, this meant that the purchasing power of those payments declined over time. In other words, while Treasury bonds provided stability and liquidity, their real returns were often negative once inflation was taken into account. Large institutions and businesses frequently held government bonds because they were highly liquid and widely accepted within the financial system. They provided a stable financial foundation during a period when much of the economy was undergoing a rapid transformation. The broader lesson from this period is that during large economic disruptions, different assets tend to serve different roles. Some generate growth, some provide stability, and some act as the financial infrastructure that allows capital to move through the system. Understanding those roles was an important part of navigating the wartime economy. The honest reckoning. Before drawing lessons from this period, it's important to add the context that many simplified financial stories leave out. Not everyone who invested in these areas during the war became wealthy. Defense companies that looked perfectly positioned sometimes struggled with execution, lost contracts to competitors, or saw their stock prices decline when military spending fell after the war ended. Commodity producers faced regulatory constraints. The Office of Price Administration imposed price ceilings across large parts of the economy. Companies could still earn profits, but those profits were often tightly controlled. Real estate investors who bought in the wrong locations or who were forced to sell during the uncertainty of the early war years often saw little benefit from the broader economic expansion. And many bond investors discovered that even safe assets can lose purchasing power when inflation rises faster than interest rates. During the war years, long-term Treasury yields were capped at roughly 2.5%, while consumer prices rose significantly. Looking back at the investors who did exceptionally well during this period, 3 common characteristics tend to appear. First, they positioned early, before the economic effects of wartime mobilization were widely understood. Second, they understood the underlying mechanisms, not simply that war increases spending, but which industries were structurally connected to that spending and how the capital flowed through the economy. And third, perhaps most importantly, they had staying power. They weren't forced to sell assets during moments of uncertainty. They had the financial stability to hold through volatility while the larger economic forces played out. That final factor is often overlooked. Even the most sophisticated investment strategy fails if an investor is forced to liquidate at the worst possible moment. The modern parallel. Why this still matters. Understanding this history isn't about nostalgia. It's about recognizing patterns in how large economic systems respond to geopolitical stress and massive government spending. Today, the global economy is experiencing several forces that, while not identical to the 1940s, have some structural similarities. Government spending in certain sectors has expanded significantly. Defense budgets around the world have increased, with the United States allocating more than $850 billion annually, and many NATO countries raising military spending after decades of relative decline. At the same time, demand for certain industrial materials has increased as economies invest in both defense production and large-scale energy transitions. In some regions, cities anchored by industries like defense, energy, or advanced technology continue to attract workers and capital, a dynamic that historically has influenced local housing demand and economic growth. None of this means the world is repeating the 1940s, but the broader lesson from that period remains relevant. When governments mobilize large amounts of capital towards specific national priorities, whether military, industrial, or technological, the effects ripple through entire supply chains and regions of the economy. The question for investors, just as it was for Harold and Chester in 1940, is whether they understand those mechanisms early, before they become obvious to everyone else. The financial industry often focuses on standardized advice, diversified portfolios, index funds, retirement accounts. Those tools are useful and important, but history also contains moments when large economic shifts reshaped entire industries and regions. Moments when informed, patient investors who understood those shifts were able to position themselves differently from the broader market. This channel exists to explore those moments. If this kind of historical financial analysis is useful to you, consider subscribing.